You don't expect to hear your name in a place like that. Not in church, not during service, and definitely not like that. But that morning, I did. I was sitting just a few rows behind them, not paying attention to anything except the quiet around me, when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice. Low, careful, like she didn't want to be heard, but I heard her. She's been taking money. For a second, I didn't move because my mind didn't catch up right away. Taking money? From where? From who? And then it hit me. They were talking about me. I stayed still, didn't turn around, didn't react, because sometimes when you react too quickly, people stop talking, and I needed to hear more. There's been things missing, she continued. I didn't want to say anything at first, but it's starting to add up. My chest tightened, not from anger, from confusion, because I knew something they didn't. Nothing was missing, not a single dollar. Every donation, every envelope, every record, I had handled all of it carefully. So how could she say something like that so confidently? And worse, why were people listening? I shifted slightly in my seat, just enough to hear more clearly without drawing attention. Another voice responded, soft, concerned. Are you sure? And that's when she said something that changed everything. I've seen enough. Seen enough. That's all it takes. Not proof, not facts, just enough to make people believe. I felt the room differently after that, not physically, but socially, like something had already moved and I was just now catching up to it. I looked ahead, keeping my face calm, but my mind was already racing. Because this wasn't just a comment, this wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was the beginning of something spreading. And once something like that starts, it doesn't stay quiet for long. I told myself to stay calm, to wait, to listen, because reacting now without understanding would only make things worse. But one thought kept coming back, clear, unavoidable. Why would she say that? Not to me, not privately, but like that, in a room full of people. I sat there through the rest of the service, hearing words but not processing them, because everything had shifted, and I could feel it, even without turning around, even without seeing their faces. I knew something had already changed, and I had just walked into the middle of it. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I had something they weren't expecting. I had proof, and before this was over, I was going to use it. By the time the service ended, I still hadn't turned around, not because I forgot what I heard, but because something in me needed a few more seconds to hold on to what the morning used to feel like before everything shifted. People started to stand, the usual movement, quiet greetings, small conversations, hands reaching across aisles. Everything looked the same on the surface, but it didn't feel the same anymore. I stood up slowly and adjusted my jacket, letting a few people pass in front of me. I wasn't in a hurry. I was listening. Because once you hear something like that, you don't just walk away from it. You pay attention. I stepped into the aisle and gave a small smile to someone I recognized. "Good morning," I said. She looked at me, smiled back, but it didn't stay. It faded too quickly, like it wasn't meant to turn into a conversation. She nodded and moved on. That was the first moment. Small, easy to ignore, but I didn't ignore it. I kept walking. A few steps ahead, I greeted another person, someone I had spoken to many times before. "Morning," I said. He hesitated just for a second, then gave a quick nod and kept moving, like stopping would have taken more effort than he was willing to give. That wasn't normal. Not here. Not with people I knew. I slowed down slightly as I reached the center of the room. Conversations were happening all around me, soft voices, light laughter, the same familiar rhythm that usually made this place feel steady. But now it felt distant, like I was close enough to see it, but not part of it. I glanced to my left. Two women were talking quietly. As my presence passed near them, their voices lowered. Not completely silent, just controlled. Then one of them looked at me. Only for a moment. Then I looked away. I kept walking, calm on the outside, but my mind was already racing. Because one moment like that can mean nothing. 2 moments can still be explained. But when it starts to repeat, you feel it. You don't need anyone to say it directly. You just know. I stepped outside into the daylight, expecting the feeling to ease once I left the room. It didn't. People were gathered in small groups near the entrance, talking, greeting each other, making plans like they always did. I had stood in that same space many times, had those same conversations, but this time, as I walked past, the energy changed again. Not dramatically, just enough. A pause in conversation, a glance, then voices picking back up, slightly lower. I stopped near the steps and looked around. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't one comment. This wasn't one moment. This was something that had already settled into the room before I even walked in. Something that didn't start today, something I hadn't noticed until now. I folded my hands in front of me and stood there, steady and composed. I wasn't going to react without understanding, not yet, but I couldn't ignore it either, because whatever this was, it had direction, and somehow that direction kept leading back to me. I took a slow breath and looked back toward the church doors. For the first time that morning, I stopped asking if something was wrong and started asking what exactly had changed and why I was the last to know. I didn't leave right away, even though everything in me said I should, because walking away would have been easier than standing there feeling something I couldn't explain. Easier than asking questions I might not want answers to. But I stayed, because if something was being said about me, I was going to find out what it was, and more importantly, why it started in the first place. I didn't leave, even though every part of me said I should, because once something like that starts, you don't just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. You either ignore it or you face it. And I wasn't going to ignore it. Not this time. I stepped down from the entrance and moved toward the side of the building, the same place I had stood so many times before after service. It was familiar, comfortable, a place where conversations used to happen easily. That's where I saw her, Mrs. Carter. She had known me for years. We had spoken more times than I could count. Shared small conversations, checked on each other, even prayed together on a few occasions. If there was anyone who would act normal, it would be her. I approached at a steady pace, keeping my expression calm. "Good morning," I said. She turned toward me, and for a brief moment, everything looked the same. The same face, the same posture, the same polite expression. But something underneath it had shifted. "Oh, good morning," she replied. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel. I waited. Usually she would ask how I was doing. Usually she would mention something about the service. Usually she would stay and talk for a moment. But this time she didn't. Her eyes moved past me, just over my shoulder, like she was expecting someone else to walk up and give her a reason to leave. Then she adjusted her bag. "I have to go meet someone," she said. "Quick, too quick. Before I could respond, she was already stepping away. I stood there for a moment, watching her walk off, blending into another group like nothing had happened. And that's when it settled in, not as a thought, as a feeling. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a bad morning. This wasn't people being distracted. This was distance, intentional distance. I turned slightly and looked around again, and now that I wasn't trying to explain it away, I could see it more clearly. The small groups that stayed just out of reach, the conversations that shifted the moment I got close. The way people acknowledged me was just enough to be polite, but not enough to engage. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, it was consistent. And once something becomes consistent, it becomes real. I folded my arms lightly and took a slow breath, grounding myself, because a new question had started to form. Not just what's happening, but something deeper. Did I miss something? I went back over the last few weeks in my mind. Every conversation, every interaction, every small moment that might have meant more than I realized at the time. Trying to find where this started, trying to remember if I said something wrong, did something wrong, overlooked something important. But nothing stood out, nothing clear, nothing that explained this. And that's when the doubt tried to settle in, quiet at first, then stronger. Because when you don't have answers, your mind starts filling in the gaps. Maybe I said something. Maybe I didn't notice something. Maybe I stopped that thought because it didn't feel right, not completely. There was something else here, something bigger than a misunderstanding. I looked back toward the church, watching people continue their conversations like everything was normal. And maybe for them it was. But for me, something had cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to let something in, awareness. Because whatever this was, it didn't start today. It had been building, quietly, before the whisper, before the looks, before I even realized it was there. And now, I was standing right in the middle of it, without knowing who started it, or why. I told myself I needed something clear, not a feeling, not a guess, something I couldn't explain away.
Because up until that point, everything could still be questioned. Maybe people were distracted. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But that didn't last long. A few minutes later, I saw Mr. Daniels walking toward me. We weren't close, but we had spoken enough times for a proper conversation, enough for a greeting that didn't feel forced. I straightened slightly and gave a small, polite smile. "Good morning," I said as he got closer. He looked at me. Not past me, not around me, at me. For a second, it felt normal. Then something shifted. His expression tightened just slightly, and instead of stopping, he gave a quick nod and kept walking. No words, no pause, just a nod and distance. I stood there, my smile fading slowly. That wasn't like him, not here, not after all the times we had stood and talked without hesitation. I turned slightly and watched him walk into a group just a few steps away. The moment he joined them, his posture relaxed, his voice picked up, and he became part of the conversation like nothing had just happened, like I wasn't standing right there. I looked away and took a slow breath. That was one. Clear enough. Then something else happened. There was a bench nearby where a woman was holding a seat, the way people sometimes do after service. I had seen it before, nothing unusual. I stepped closer, not assuming anything, just moving naturally. "Is this seat taken?" I asked. She looked up at me, and this time there was no hesitation. "Yes," she said, flat, direct. I nodded. "All right," and I stepped back.
But I didn't walk away immediately because something felt off. The seat stayed empty. No one came, no one approached. Time passed and that space remained open. That's when it became undeniable. Politeness doesn't leave a seat empty. Politeness doesn't avoid a simple conversation. Politeness doesn't shift the way people are shifting around me. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was something else, something intentional. I moved away from the bench and stood near the edge of the walkway, letting people pass, giving myself space to observe without being in the center of it. And for the first time that morning, I stopped trying to soften it, because once something becomes clear, you don't need to make it comfortable to accept it. You just have to face it. And what I was facing was rejected, quiet, controlled, but undeniable. I looked around one more time, not searching anymore, just confirming what I already knew. The glances, the pauses, the way conversations adjusted when I got close. It was all connected, all pointing in the same direction. And in that direction was me. I stood there, steady, composed, not reacting outwardly, but fully aware now. Because whatever this was, it had already spread. And whatever they believed, it had already been decided without me. That thought settled heavily, not because it surprised me anymore, but because of what it meant. Someone had said something, someone had started this, and the way people were reacting, it wasn't small, it had weight, it had reached, and I was only just beginning to see how far it had gone. I folded my hands in front of me and took a slow breath. Because now, this wasn't about wondering anymore. This was about finding out the truth, not from looks, not from silence, but from someone who knew exactly where this started. And I had a feeling I was getting closer to that answer. I left not long after that, not because I wanted to, but because staying there, pretending everything was normal, felt harder than walking away. I walked slowly to my car, taking my time, letting the distance build between me and everything I had just felt. When I got inside, I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, hands resting in my lap, eyes forward. And that's when everything started coming back. Not what just happened, what came before it. Because nothing like this starts all at once. It builds, quietly. I leaned back slightly and let my mind go back a few weeks, back to small moments I didn't pay attention to at the time, conversations that felt shorter than usual, people who seemed distracted, a few missed greetings that I told myself didn't mean anything. At the time, I ignored it because it was easy to ignore. Nothing was clear enough to question, nothing was strong enough to confront, but now, all of it felt different. Now it felt connected. I thought about the donation records, every envelope, every contribution, every detail I handled. I had been careful, always, not just because it was expected, but because I respected what it meant. That responsibility wasn't something I took lightly. Everything was written down. Everything was accounted for. There was no gap. No missing money, no reason for anyone to question anything. So how did this start? I sat there, going over it again and again, trying to find the moment where something could have been misunderstood, but there was nothing. And that's what made it worse. Because when there's no mistake, no explanation, the problem isn't confusion, it's something else, something intentional. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. I hadn't planned to look at it, but now I need to. I opened it slowly. Records, dates, amounts. Everything is in order, exactly the way it should be. I flipped through a few pages, not searching for errors, just confirming what I already knew. Everything was clean, clear, accurate. I closed the folder and held it in my hands for a moment. because now I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't about money. This was about belief. Someone said something, and people believed it, not because they saw proof, but because they heard it enough. I sat there quietly, letting that settle. Because that kind of situation doesn't fix itself. It doesn't fade. It grows. And if you don't stop it early, it becomes something permanent. I looked back toward the church through the windshield. People were still outside, still talking, still moving like everything was normal. But now I could see it differently. Not the surface, what was underneath it. Because once you know something is being said about you, everything changes. The way you look at people, the way you hear conversations, the way you understand silence. I took a slow breath and placed the folder back into my bag. Because one thing was clear now, I wasn't dealing with confusion. I was dealing with something that had already taken shape. And if I wanted it to stop, I couldn't stay quiet. Not this time. Because this wasn't just about my name, it was about my integrity, and that's not something I was going to let anyone rewrite, not without the truth being heard. I was about to leave. My hand was already on the key, ready to start the car and put distance between me and everything that morning had become. But something stopped me. Not fear, no hesitation, just a quiet feeling that leaving now would mean walking away without answers, and I wasn't ready to do that. Not anymore. I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me, then turned back toward the church. Most people are gone now. The crowd had thinned out, leaving only a few small groups scattered near the entrance and along the walkway. The energy was different, quieter, but not lighter. I walked slowly, not toward anyone in particular, just present, observing, and that's when I noticed her. She wasn't talking, wasn't standing in a group, just off to the side, like she was waiting for something or someone. Watching, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that if you were paying attention, you would see it. And I was paying attention. Our eyes met for a brief second. She looked away quickly, too quickly. That told me everything. I didn't rush over. I didn't call out. I just walked in her direction at a normal pace, giving her time to either stay or leave. She stayed, but she shifted slightly, like she wasn't sure if she should. When I got close, I stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me," I said calmly. She turned toward me. Her expression wasn't cold like the others. It wasn't distant. It was hesitant. "Yes," she replied. I looked at her for a moment, not confrontational, just steady. "I need to ask you something," I said. She nodded, but I could see it in her posture. She already knew this wasn't a casual conversation. "I heard something during the service," I continued, keeping my voice even, "and I'm trying to understand if it has anything to do with me." There was a brief pause, not long, but enough. Her eyes shifted slightly, like she was thinking carefully about what to say or what not to say. "I don't know what you heard," she said. And technically that wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. I held her gaze, not pushing, just present. "Something feels off," I said, "and I'm not here to accuse anyone. I just want to understand." That's when it changed. Not her words, her expression. Something softened for a moment, then tightened again, like she was deciding between staying silent or saying something she probably shouldn't. She glanced around quickly, checking who was nearby. Then she stepped a little closer. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to lower her voice. "You didn't hear this from me," she said quietly. "They're all listening. There's been talk," she continued. talk. That one word carried more weight than anything else. What kind of talk? I asked. My voice was calm but focused. She hesitated again, but not for long this time. About you, she said. Clear, direct, no confusion now. For a second, everything around us faded. Not literally, but enough that her words were the only thing that mattered. Why? I asked. Simple, but it held everything. She shook her head slightly. I don't know everything, she said quickly, but people have been saying things. Things, always things, unclear, unconfirmed, but powerful enough to change how people look at you, how they treat you, how they decide whether you belong. I let that settle for a moment because I understood something now. This wasn't about one person. This wasn't about one moment. This had spread, quietly, from one conversation to another, from one person to the next, until it became something accepted without being questioned. I looked at her again. Do you believe it? I asked. That caught her off guard. I don't know, she admitted. Honest, uncomfortable, real. And that was enough, because I wasn't looking for certainty anymore. I was looking for direction, and she had given me that. I nodded slowly. Thank you, I said. She gave a small nod and stepped back, relieved like she had said just enough without saying too much. I turned away from her and looked back toward the church one more time. And now everything made sense. Not the details, not the full story, but the pattern, the looks, the distance, the silence. It all came from something that had already taken shape before I even realized it existed. And now I wasn't just feeling it or seeing it, I was stepping into it. Because whatever they were saying, whatever they believed, I was going to hear it for myself, not through whispers, not through distance, but directly. And this time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. I didn't go home, not after that, because now I knew there was something being said, and walking away would have meant letting it stay unfinished, and I wasn't going to do that. Not this time. I turned back toward the church doors and walked inside. The building was quiet now. Most people had already left, and a few remained, scattered across the room, gathering their things or finishing small conversations. The atmosphere felt still, not peaceful, just waiting. I stepped down the aisle slowly, my footsteps soft, my eyes steady and focused. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was looking for answers, and I knew exactly where to start. Near the front, I saw her, my daughter-in-law. She was standing beside another woman, speaking in a low voice, the same tone I had heard earlier behind me, careful, controlled, like every word had purpose. I walked toward her, not fast, not slow, just steady. She noticed me before I reached her. Her voice stopped. The other woman beside her looked between us, then quietly stepped away, like she understood this wasn't a casual moment. I stopped in front of her, close enough that she couldn't pretend I wasn't there. I need to talk to you, I said. My voice was calm, not sharp, not emotional, just clear. She looked at me, holding her composure. Yes, she replied, controlled, but I could see it, a slight shift, a flicker. She knew. I nodded once. I heard what you said during the service. No accusation, no raised voice, just the truth. Her expression didn't break, but it changed, subtly. I don't know what you mean, she said quickly, almost too quickly to sound natural. I held her gaze without rushing to respond, watching closely as her posture shifted and her eyes struggled to stay steady on mine. She felt it, even without me saying anything. "I heard you," I said calmly. "You said I've been taking money." I made sure every word was clear and direct, nothing softened, nothing hidden. The air between us changed. She glanced to the side for a brief moment, then looked back at me. "I think you misunderstood," she replied. There it was, the first attempt to defend herself. I nodded slightly. "That's possible, which is why I'm asking you directly." My voice stayed even and controlled. I wasn't there to argue, I was there to get clarity. "I want to understand why you would say something like that," I added. She hesitated, and that hesitation spoke louder than any answer. If there had been nothing behind it, she would have responded immediately. But instead she paused, thinking, weighing her words. She crossed her arms lightly, trying to hold her composure. "People have been noticing things. I'm not the only one." It wasn't an answer, it was a deflection. I kept my eyes on her. "Then be specific. What exactly have people been noticing?" Again, she didn't answer right away. Her eyes shifted as if she was deciding how much she was willing to reveal. "I've seen enough to be concerned," she said finally. Concerned, another vague word with no substance, another statement without proof. I let that settle for a moment before speaking again. "And instead of coming to me, you said it to others." That landed, because it was true. She didn't respond, not immediately. That told me everything. I nodded slowly as the situation became clearer in my mind. This wasn't about the truth, this was about perception. Something had been said, repeated, and passed around until it became something people believed. I took a small step back, not because I was done, but because I had reached the limit of what she was willing to admit. "I'm going to ask you one more time," I said calmly. "Is there any proof behind what you're saying?" She looked at me and held my gaze, but when the moment came, she didn't answer directly. "I think this conversation is over," she said. That was her answer. Not denial, not confirmation, just avoidance. I nodded once, slowly and deliberately, because I understood now. She wasn't going to say it clearly, not in a way that could be questioned or challenged. She didn't need to, because the damage had already begun. I looked at her one last time, not with anger or emotion, but with clarity. "All right," I said. Then I stepped back and turned away. As I walked, everything settled inside me. The confusion was gone, the doubt was gone. All that remained was clarity. Because the truth isn't always found in what people say. Sometimes it's revealed in what they refuse to say. And what she refused to say told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something that had already been built, already shared, already believed. Now it was my turn to respond, not with emotion, not with arguments, but with something stronger. Proof. I didn't rush after that, because once you have the truth, there's no need to chase anything. You let it come. I stepped outside again, moving slower, more aware of everything around me. A few people were still gathered near the entrance, standing in small groups, talking quietly, watching without making it obvious. The tension was still there, the attention was still there, but this time, everything felt different. It wasn't one-sided. I walked toward them, not hesitant, not uncertain, just steady. The conversation didn't stop immediately, but it changed. Voices lowered, eyes shifted. that same pattern, but now I understand it, and this time I didn't slow down. I stopped right there, close enough that no one could pretend I wasn't part of the moment. No one spoke, and I didn't wait for them to. "I think it's time we stop talking quietly," I said. My voice is calm, controlled, but clear enough to hold the space. A few of them exchanged quick glances, that same look people give when something unspoken is suddenly brought into the open. "I've heard what's being said," I continued, "and I'm here to address it directly. No anger, no hesitation, just clarity." Silence settled again, but it felt different now, not uncertain, expectant. Then someone spoke. "We were told you've been taking money." There it was, out in the open. No whisper this time, no distance, just words. I nodded slightly. "I know that's what you were told," I said. Not defensive, not emotional, just steady. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the same one I had looked at earlier, the one I already knew held everything I needed. "This," I said, holding it in front of me, "is every record I've handled." I opened it. Pages, dates, amounts, clear, documented, accounted for. I didn't rush through it. I let them see it, let them process it. Every donation is recorded. Every amount is tracked. Nothing is missing. I looked up at them, one by one, because now this wasn't about me proving something. It was about them realizing something. The shift started small, a change in posture, a glance between people, the certainty they had earlier starting to weaken. "Anyone is free to look," I added, placing the folder slightly forward. No one moved immediately, because belief is easy when it's unchallenged, but when it's faced with something real, it starts to break. The woman who spoke earlier stepped closer first, slowly, carefully. She looked down at the pages, then flipped one, then another. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. That small shift spread. Others leaned in slightly, not fully stepping forward, but close enough to see. And that's when it happened. Not loudly, not all at once, but clearly. The moment the story started to fall apart. I closed the folder gently because I didn't need to keep proving it. It was already done. "There was never anything missing," I said, calm, certain. "And if anyone had asked me directly, we wouldn't be standing here like this." That landed, because that was the truth behind all of it. No one asked. They listened. They assumed. They repeated. I looked at them one more time, faces that had watched me differently just moments ago, now watching with something else, uncertainty. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anything, because I didn't need to. The power had already shifted, not because I argued, but because I showed the truth. And truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be clear. I stepped back slightly, giving them space, not for them, for myself, because I wasn't standing there to convince them anymore. I was standing there because I knew, and now, so did they. No one spoke right away. Not after that. The words had already been said, and the truth had already done what it needed to do. I looked at them, the same people who couldn't meet my eyes earlier, and now they were looking. Not with certainty, not with quiet agreement, but with something else. Doubt. The kind that settles in when something you believed no longer holds. I didn't say anything else, because I didn't need to. The folder in my hand had already answered every question they should have asked from the beginning. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped back slightly, like she needed distance from what she had just repeated. And in that moment, it became clear. Not everything needs a confrontation to end. Some things end the moment they're exposed. I took a slow breath and straightened slightly, not to prove anything, but because I could, because the weight I walked in with wasn't mine anymore. I'm not going to defend something I didn't do, I said. Calm, clear, not directed at one person, directed at all of them. If anyone has questions, you can come to me directly. Simple, firm, no emotion behind it. Because I wasn't asking for understanding, I was setting a boundary. I let that settle for a moment, then continued. But I won't stay in a place where people decide who I am without ever speaking to me. That shifted something, not loudly, but enough. Because now it wasn't about what they believed, it was about what I was willing to accept, and I wasn't accepting it. Not anymore. I looked at them one last time, not searching for an apology, not waiting for a response, just seeing them clearly. Because that was the difference now. Earlier, I was trying to understand what had changed. Now, I understood exactly what it was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. This wasn't true. This wasn't fact. This was an assumption, and assumption doesn't hold power once it's challenged. I turned and began to walk away, not slowly, not dramatically, just done. The same steps that felt heavy earlier now felt different, lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I wasn't carrying it anymore. I reached the end of the walkway and paused for a brief moment, not to look back, but to recognize something. I had walked into that place thinking I belonged there. Then I heard something that made me question it. Now I am leaving not because they pushed me out, but because I chose not to stay where I wasn't respected. Belonging isn't decided in whispers. It's not built on what people assume about you, and it's not something you lose just because someone says you don't have it. I took a breath and continued walking, because I didn't need that space to define me, and I didn't need their silence to validate me. I already knew who I was, and that was something no one could take away. Not with words, not with distance, not even with belief, because truth doesn't depend on who repeats it. It stands, whether people accept it or not. And as I walked away, I didn't feel rejected. I felt clear, because I didn't leave with less. I left with something stronger, clarity. I keep thinking about how quickly everything changed, not because something was proven, but because something was said. And that's what stayed with me. Because sometimes it's not what people know about you, it's what they choose to believe. So let me ask you something. If you were in that situation, would you stay quiet and gather proof, or would you confront them the moment you heard it? Be honest. I really want to know how you would handle it. Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, stories about truth, betrayal, and standing your ground when everything turns against you, subscribe to Quiet Voice of Her Life. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest truths.